intelligence. Again, my name is Sylvester Salcedo. Just by way of an introduction, I am 57 years old, in spite of what everybody tries to tell me. Currently, I am an attorney in private practice, formerly out of Bridgeport, but now I've recently moved my practice to my hometown in Orange, Connecticut. And regarding the war on drugs, I am a retired naval intelligence officer. I joined the Navy right out of college, Holy Cross in Worcester, Massachusetts, where I was a religious studies major, but I joined the Navy the fall after my graduation. I ended up basically converting from surface warfare to the Naval Reserve Intelligence Program. And because I did my Spanish homework in high school, somebody had the bright idea to assign me to Colombia as the Naval Reserve Naval Attaché, Assistant Naval Attaché. So I was in that billet for about 5 years, from about 1980 to 85. And given that background, that was the height of obviously the cocaine king Pablo Escobar in Colombia. But the funny, not funny, but funny interesting part of it is that until 1989, the Department of Defense was not allowed to be involved with the war on drugs. It was viewed nationally as a law enforcement matter, never as a Department of Defense matter, until the fall of the Berlin Wall and the end of the Soviet Empire. So I believe beginning 1989, initial President Reagan, and then followed by President George Bush, number 41, followed up on this path down to getting the Department of Defense engaged in the war on drugs. But nothing really overt. Mostly it was in support roles. So given my background in the reserves and the intelligence department, a number of my fellow shipmates and fellow intelligence officers from the other sister services, the Army, the Air Force, and the Marine Corps, we were invited by the Department of Justice to participate in a number of joint operations, something that was focused primarily out of Fort Bliss, Texas. It was called the JTF-6, Joint Task Force 6. And the mission of Joint Task Force 6 was to send individual or groups of intelligence officers and intelligence enlisted men and women to support various federal law enforcement agencies, state police, as well as the local police. So in my case, I did 5 of these 6-month tours. Initially in New York City with the FBI, I believe that was in the fall of 1996, followed by a tour in Puerto Rico with the U.S. Customs, and then back to New York for another tour with what was then called the HIDA, High Intensity Drug Trafficking Area, and then to Miami on my 4th tour, and I believe I was there on a multi-agency support role. So it was a whole, I call it the sort of food court of all the federal law agencies, beginning, of course, with DEA, FBI, ATF, and so on. And I think the final tour I did was back to New York City with the U.S. Customs Service, which, of course, today that has been melded into what's now, I believe, the Immigration and Customs Service. So with that experience, that was ending in the year 2000, which coincided, of course, with my 20th year of service in the military. And given that I was a lieutenant commander and unfortunately did not make the next promotion to a full commander, I was under a mandatory retirement order. So I went into retirement, and that summer of 2000, President Clinton was working with the Republican-dominated Congress, and they were pushing for what was then called Plan Colombia, which was to give Colombia $1.8 billion to ostensibly fight the war on drugs in Colombia. But I think it was really sort of a shaded deal to really fight a counter insurgency in Colombia, which they've had for 40 years over there. And so I thought that was a waste of money, so I did what I could as an individual, and I protested. I basically followed my brothers and sisters from the Vietnam era, who you had a lot of Vietnam veterans who protested against the Vietnam War, such as, for example, today, Secretary of State John Kerry was one of those very prominent young men back then in the early 70s. So what I did is I sent a medal. It was called the Navy Marine Corps Commendation Medal. achievement medal that I was awarded for my work in the war on drugs on those tours. And I tried to tell President Clinton, send the message that this was a wasteful way to address the drug situation in our country. I didn't think by sending money overseas to Colombia or elsewhere in the world would really solve this. I thought we should keep the money at home and address it more on a prevention and on a treatment level rather than an interdiction effort, which really is quite wasteful. You don't really get anywhere. You can see the history even since I've retired. Here we are today sitting together in the year 2014 in the wonderful city of Norwich. And if you go to our streets anywhere across Connecticut or anywhere across our nation, the level of availability of drugs, may it be heroin to marijuana, methamphetamines, is at record levels. And so the question always comes back, what do we do as a community, as a city, as a state, as a nation? And I personally, I have a few ideas that they're really not new ideas. They're basically some well-established analysis that I've come up with and points of view that I would like to be able to share and make the, extra effort again. Maybe I'm not really doing such a great job convincing people, but there's no harm in trying, is my philosophy.
Okay, well, thank you. And we will get into specific points about the war on drugs. One thing I'm curious about is the path that you took and being on the front lines on the war on drugs. At some point, you must have become disillusioned with certain things about the war on drugs. As you said, you retired in '99 and protested.
Yes. Well, this is the way I look at it. In many ways, back then my role was, obviously I was in the Naval Reserve program, and I really enjoyed that. As a matter of fact, just a couple of years before these tours that I took, these 6-month rotational tours, I was actually a student during the first Gulf War in the fall of 1990 to the spring of 1991. I was a student at the Naval War College in Newport. So as a reservist, to be in the midst, surrounded by 200 of my other fellow lieutenant commanders or major types in the Marine Corps and Air Force and Army, it was a wonderful experience to basically be on an educational sabbatical. You're really being a graduate student. You have these free-flowing exchanges of experiences and getting to learn more about our other sister service branches, such as obviously the Coast Guard, the Marines, the Air Force, and the Army, to sort of see what other middle grade officers, such as myself at the time, had experience from the day they were commissioned to that point in our mid-career, and then to try to project what we would do in the future. But then the other issue at the time was obviously Saddam Hussein, who had just walked and walked all over his neighbor in Kuwait. And so that was a turning point for us as a nation. And I remember personally, specifically feeling when I left the Naval War College that the atmosphere in the country had really turned around. Whereas from the time I had joined the military in 1978 to that point in 1991, most people really did not have either a strong or harsh feeling towards the military. It was just sort of, it was there. Maybe the harsh feelings that our Vietnam veteran, fellow veterans had felt, the sort of animosity, the name calling, and even worse, just ignoring them, really dissipated. And all of a sudden, Americans found a new image, a new respect for people who wore the uniform. So that was significant. But with that as background, as sort of a background, I remembered specifically that drugs was an issue, and the war on drugs specifically is something that I, as a reservist, brought up to my fellow classmates, because all of them, if you join the military when you're 22 years old, you get commissioned, and up to about 12 years to about, we were probably around our 12th or 13th year in the military service at the time, as lieutenant commanders or major types, you really are in a military cocoon, so to speak. You live on a military base, your children go to the military-sponsored schools, and your whole life revolves around the military mission, your branch of service, et cetera. Whereas for me, I did 4 years of active service. I was on a ship. I was an admiral's staff officer. But yet I left and I became a public school teacher in Boston in an urban setting. I became a small-time little entrepreneur, printing T-shirts and trying to win contracts and that sort of thing. So I had a more varied experience than my other fellow officers. And one of those, of course, is the issue of drugs. I obviously, being in an urban setting, I experienced a very different perspective of what was going on with my students and their families and the setting in Boston. So when I shared this whole issue about drugs, that it was not really a war that the military should fight, because that was one of the debates back then, is that, excuse me, is that until Saddam Hussein came around, and between 1989 and the fall of the Soviet Empire and the Soviet military bloc, to the Saddam Hussein's invasion of Kuwait, you really had a 2-year period there where the military sort of didn't have a mission. So you had this mission creep towards the war on drugs. And so that was what was happening at the time. And I remembered talking to a fellow Air Force officer one day, who of course is a B-52 pilot, and he was saying that, well, we could always get up our airplanes and bomb these heroin fields or marijuana fields. I said, well, that's not cost effective. Your bomb drops on one spot. I mean, marijuana fields are all over the place. And I said, what about those fields that are actually in some poor peasant farmer's backyard? I mean, you're going to blow up his whole family? You can't do that. There's always this balancing act between what is the mission and does it really accomplish your goal, which in this case, what we really wanted to do, of course, everybody's focused on a drug-free America, which is near impossible. And maybe that really shouldn't be the goal. And so what I thought of is that I read more about the harm reduction philosophy and worldview, and I'm convinced that that's really the way to go. So it brings us to today, where, for example, now across Connecticut, across this country, there's a new recognition of a growing number of overdose deaths based on heroin use and abuse. There's a growing concern amongst communities, because now it's not only perceived as a quote-unquote urban problem that only affects, let's say, the urban population, the minority population of African Americans or Latinos or poor whites, but now that it's going into the suburbs and into rural areas. But frankly, it was always all over, because if you look at it from the perspective of the so-called drug dealers, they look at this as a business, and they will go and supply wherever they find demand. So today, that's where we are. Unfortunately, we have a population that has fallen into any level or any stage of drug addiction or addiction to pain management vehicles. May it be a legitimate drug that your primary care doctor provides you because you got into a car accident, you have back pain, you have a sore knee, or you go to a dentist and you have a painful toothache. And so what happens is, my concern is that what happens after you unfortunately develop an addiction to opiates and opioids. That's really the question of what I would like to address. So the Connecticut Heroin Users Union, this is something I just came up with. It's called the CHU. It's not a bad Chinese food restaurant or anything like that. But the CHUU, Connecticut Heroin Users Union, is something that is sort of a brainchild that I came up with back in February. I was at home in Orange, and I read our daily area newspaper, the New Haven Register, and on, I believe it was February 7th. I always read, obviously, the headlines and then all the letters to the editor and their editorial. And the editorial on that day announced a call to action. And I think the editorial really was more or less pointed towards the elected public officials. I don't know if it was directed at the governor or the mayor of New Haven or their aldermen, et cetera, or state representatives and state senators. But it said there generally, it said, heroin is making a big comeback, a big, terrible comeback in the New Haven area. The New Haven Register is a sister newspaper to the Register Citizen in Torrington. And Torrington, I believe I was tracking it beginning sometime before my birthday, so that must have been middle of November. Before Thanksgiving, I saw this article written by a couple of young reporters up there about how Torrington was going through this gut-wrenching experience of higher than the national average of drug overdose due to heroin. And so, obviously, because of my background and my past, this piqued my interest. On February 7th from the New Haven Register, I said to myself, well, let me let a month or a couple of months go by and see what will our elected officials or